The winter came early to the Rockies that year. Not the kind of early that old-timers bragged about, not a dusting of snow that melted by noon, but a hard arrival, silent, decisive, and final. By mid-November, the high trails were already gone, swallowed under wind-packed drifts. Creek edges froze solid overnight. The mountains stopped offering second chances. In these ranges, winter was never just a season. It was a reckoning. Small settlements clung to the valleys and lower ridges. Trappers, timber crews, a handful of families who believed they understood this land well enough to stay. Most of them had survived many winters before. They trusted what had worked. Big cabins, tall ceilings, wide hearths, fires kept alive through the night. They trusted size. They trusted flame. But that winter began to challenge those assumptions. Wood piles shrank faster than expected. Cold settled into walls instead of staying outside them. Men woke before dawn to find water buckets frozen solid beside still-burning fires. Heat rose, escaped, vanished into the thin mountain air, leaving boots stiff and hands numb by morning. And still, farther up the slope, away from the main trail, one man worked alone. He wasn't new to the mountains. He wasn't young. And he wasn't interested in opinions. His cabin sat apart, close enough to be noticed, far enough to be ignored. From a distance, it looked wrong. Too small. Too low. Too heavy with stone for a place where timber was king. Those who passed by shook their heads and kept walking. In the Rockies, you learned early not to waste time questioning another man's choices, especially if they looked like mistakes. But as the cold deepened, the questions returned. How long could anyone last in a shelter that small? Where would the heat go? What happens when the real cold comes? The mountains were about to answer those questions. And when they did, everything people thought they knew about staying warm would be tested. Not by theory, not by argument, but by numbers no one was prepared to believe. Winter had arrived early. And somewhere on that frozen slope, a quiet experiment had already begun. They called him a mountain man, though even that label felt imprecise. He wasn't the loud kind, not a storyteller in the saloon, not a man eager to prove how long he'd survived out here. He spoke little, worked steadily, and kept his distance, not out of arrogance, but habit. The mountains had taught him that solitude was safer than attention. No one knew exactly how many winters he'd spent moving through cold country. Some said he'd trapped far north. Others believed he'd crossed ranges where winter lasted 9 months and mercy lasted none. What mattered wasn't where he'd been, but what he'd learned and what he refused to explain. His cabin stood on a slight rise above the valley floor, sheltered from the worst winds but not hidden. Anyone hauling supplies or checking trap lines could see it, and everyone noticed the same things. It was too small, 12 by 14 feet, maybe less. A footprint more suited to a storage shed than a winter dwelling. The roof sat low, forcing tall men to duck. The walls were thick, unnaturally so, and stone appeared everywhere it didn't belong. In a region where timber defined survival, he'd chosen weight over space. "Looks like a coffin," one trapper muttered as he passed. Others laughed. Some shook their heads. A few felt uneasy without knowing why. In the Rockies, size had always been security. Big rooms meant room to move, room to dry gear, room for heat to spread. Tall ceilings kept smoke clear. Large fires meant safety through sheer force. That was the logic passed down from camp to camp, winter to winter. This cabin rejected all of it. The door was narrow. The windows were small. There was no sign of a massive hearth or an oversized chimney. No place to stack logs inside for constant feeding. And yet the man kept building with calm precision, as if following a plan no one else could see. When questioned, he didn't argue. When warned, he didn't adjust. He worked stone by stone, log by log, measuring nothing with tools anyone recognized. His hands knew the weight of materials. His pauses were deliberate. He seemed less concerned with how the cabin looked and more with how it would behave. Once the cold stopped being theoretical, the others let him be. That was the frontier way. But as the nights grew colder and the first real frost crept into bedding and boots, glances toward that strange little cabin lingered longer than before. Doubt began to mix with curiosity, because winter hadn't even shown its worst face yet, and the mountains were patient. As the walls began to rise, the judgment hardened. Men who had survived 20 winters in the Rockies stopped pretending curiosity and spoke plainly. They had seen bad cabins before. They had buried men who trusted the wrong designs. Cold did not forgive mistakes, and it did not reward cleverness. It rewarded what had already proven itself. And this cabin violated every proven rule. The footprint stayed small. No attempt was made to expand it. No late change of heart. Each log went exactly where it was meant to go, stacked with a care that bordered on stubbornness. The ceiling height never increased. The structure pressed inward instead of reaching outward, like something meant to conserve rather than impress. Then there was the stone. Stone belonged in foundations, corner supports at best. Everyone knew that. Too much stone pulled warmth out of a room and fed it to the ground. Stone floors froze boots. Stone walls bled heat. You built light and burned hard. That was how you survived. But this man kept hauling stone up the slope. Heavy pieces. Dense ones. The kind that strained the back and punished the hands. He fitted them together tightly, not as scattered support, but as a continuous mass. Some stones disappeared beneath the floor line. Others formed shapes that made no sense to anyone watching. "That's going to steal every bit of heat you make," one logger said. "Stone don't care how hard you work." The mountain man didn't respond. Inside the walls, space vanished. Thick construction reduced an already small interior to something that felt almost unreasonable. No wide room to pace. No extra corner to waste. Every inch seemed accounted for, and none of it aligned with comfort as the others understood it. Even the roof raised eyebrows. Instead of lifting heat upward, it pressed down. Low. Heavy. Built to hold weight, not shed it. Snow would sit there all winter, adding pressure instead of sliding off. Another mistake, they said. Another burden. But the strangest choice came last. The hearth wasn't placed where it belonged. Not against an outside wall. Not centered for show. It sat angled, tucked into the interior corner like an afterthought. Small. Controlled. Nothing about it suggested the roaring fires everyone relied on when temperatures collapsed. "You'll never keep up," someone warned him. "You'll be feeding that thing all night." Still, no argument. No defense. Just work. By the time the cabin stood complete, the verdict was unanimous. It was too small, too heavy, too closed in, built by a man either ignorant of mountain winters or arrogant enough to think he could outthink them. The cold had not yet arrived in full. But when it did, everyone agreed on one thing. This cabin would be the first to fail. What the others never stopped to consider was not what the cabin looked like, but what it rested on. Cabins in the Rockies were usually lifted off the ground on cornerstones, maybe a few extra supports if the builder was cautious. Air moved freely beneath them. Cold lived there. Floors froze. That was accepted as the price of winter. This cabin was different. Before the first log ever rose, the mountain man had spent weeks working the ground itself. He didn't dig deep, but he dug wide. The trench extended inward beyond where any wall would stand, as if the floor mattered more than the walls above it. Into that space, he placed stone, deliberately chosen, carefully fitted. Not all stone would do. He rejected the brittle pieces, the layered ones that fractured under stress. He selected dense rock, heavy enough to punish the hands, slow enough to warm. The kind of stone that didn't give up heat quickly once it had taken it in. Piece by piece, he created a continuous mass beneath the cabin floor. Not isolated supports. Not scattered weight. One connected body of stone, locked together so tightly that air had nowhere to hide between it. When the floor went down, it rested directly on that mass. No crawl space. No air gap. No separation. Those who noticed shook their heads. "You're building a cold sink," one man said. "That floor will pull heat straight out of you." But the mountain man understood something most of them had never been forced to learn. Stone does not steal heat. It stores it. Air warms quickly and escapes just as fast. Wood insulates but remembers nothing. Stone absorbs slowly and gives back slowly. The weight beneath that floor was not a liability. It was a reservoir. Above it, the cabin remained small by design. Less air meant less waste. Every cubic foot counted. Every surface mattered. The stone was not there to warm boots for an hour. It was there to remember fire long after flames disappeared. No one could feel it yet. Not with daytime temperatures still manageable. Not with fires still burning out of habit instead of necessity. But beneath that quiet cabin, under a layer of clay and timber, something had already been prepared. A place where heat would go when the fire stopped. A place where winter would meet resistance it did not expect. If the stone beneath the floor unsettled them, the hearth finished the job. In mountain country, a fireplace was a declaration. Big fireboxes meant security. Tall chimneys meant survival. You built them against exterior walls so smoke could escape quickly and draft could pull hard. You fed them constantly, because if the fire died, so did your warmth. This hearth followed none of those rules. It was small, deliberately so, barely wide enough to hold 2 split logs at once. No cavernous opening. No room for waste. Every inch of it seemed designed to limit fire rather than celebrate it. Worse, it wasn't even placed where it belonged. Instead of sitting against an outside wall, the firebox was tucked into an interior corner, angled slightly toward the room. The chimney rose straight up through the living space for several feet before finally turning and exiting through the roof. Men who noticed that detail didn't bother hiding their concern. "You'll smoke yourself out," one said. "That draft won't hold," another warned. "Heat goes up," a third insisted. "You're giving it nowhere to go but back into the room." The mountain man listened without comment. What they didn't understand was that this fire was never meant to heat air. It was meant to heat mass. The firebox was surrounded on nearly every side by stone, thick, dense, unbroken. When fire burned inside it, the flames licked stone instead of empty space. Heat spread sideways and downward before it ever rose. The angled placement wasn't decorative. It directed radiant energy across the largest possible stone surface, slowing the fire's escape. And the chimney itself was part of the plan. As hot gases climbed upward, they passed through stone and clay inside the cabin before reaching the outside air. Every foot of that interior path bled heat into the room. Not violently, not all at once, but steadily. This wasn't a fire meant to be kept alive all night. It was a fire meant to burn hot, then be allowed to die. That idea unsettled everyone who heard it. In the Rockies, letting a fire go out in winter bordered on suicide. Flames were comfort. Flames were reassurance. Flames were what kept men awake through the long nights, feeding logs into the darkness. But this cabin was not built for flame. It was built for what came after. No one argued anymore. There was nothing left to say. The structure was finished. The choices were locked in place. The mountain man moved inside as the cold deepened, carrying with him only what he needed. The mountains watched quietly, and winter was still holding back. The real cold did not arrive with drama. There was no storm, no roaring wind, no warning thunder in the mountains. It came the way the worst cold always does, quietly. The sky cleared. The air went still. Sound carried too far. Breath hung longer than it should have. Men stepped outside before dawn and felt it immediately, that sharp, unnatural bite in the lungs that meant the temperature had fallen past anything reason could manage. By the second night, water froze solid inside cabins that still had fires burning. Frost crept down interior walls like slow-moving veins. Axe handles left leaning by doors were rimed with ice by morning. This was the kind of cold that punished mistakes. Fires burned constantly now, not for comfort, but for survival. Men fed them through the night, half asleep, burning wood faster than planned, faster than safe. Logs popped and hissed as moisture flashed to steam. Sparks leapt onto floors. Chimneys groaned under the strain. Cabins built large began to betray their size. Heat rose. Ceilings trapped it. Walls leaked it. The air near the floor stayed bitter, no matter how hard the fire roared. Boots froze stiff by morning. Blankets felt thin. Sleep came in fragments. By the third day, wood piles were visibly lower. Men started counting. How much they had left, how many nights they could last if the cold held. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt the same quiet pressure building. If this snap lasted too long, some cabins wouldn't make it through intact. Someone mentioned the small cabin up the slope. Not mockingly this time. Just a name, spoken into the firelight, followed by silence. "He's alone up there," one man said finally. "If anyone's in trouble, it's him." No one argued. The mountain man had built against habit, against tradition, against everything that had ever worked out here. And now the mountains had stopped compromising. This was the test. Not theory, not belief, but numbers written in frozen breath and shrinking wood piles. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. And somewhere above the valley floor, in a cabin everyone had already judged a failure, a fire burned, and then was allowed to die. By the fourth night, no one was sleeping. The cold had dropped past what men argued about and into what they feared. Thermometers, when they still worked, showed numbers most trappers only remembered from stories. 20 below, then lower. The kind of cold where sound sharpens and would cracks without warning. Inside the larger cabins, fires raged non-stop. Flames roared high enough to lick iron grates red. Men fed logs into them every hour, sometimes every 30 minutes, afraid to let the heat dip even briefly. And still the floors stayed cold. Still, breath fogged in the dark. Wood piles were nearly gone. That was when someone finally said it out loud. "We should check the cabin up the slope." No one laughed. It took time to prepare for the walk. Layers went on one by one. Faces were wrapped until only eyes remained. The short climb felt longer than it ever had. Each breath burned. Snow squeaked underfoot, dry and sharp, a sound that only came when cold reached dangerous depths. They expected silence. They expected darkness. They expected to find a man huddled near a dead fire, or worse. Instead, they saw smoke. Not thick, desperate smoke. Not the kind that poured from an overworked chimney. Just a thin, steady line drifting upward into the still night. Someone was alive in there. When the door opened, the difference hit them like a wall. Warmth. Not survival warmth. Not the barely holding on heat of their own cabins. This was different. It wrapped around frozen clothing instantly. Snow began to melt and drip from sleeves and collars. Frost cracked from beards. The mountain man stood there calmly, shirt open at the neck, sleeves rolled up. Inside, the space was small, but it didn't matter. The air was steady. The cold had no grip here. A modest fire burned in the corner hearth. No larger than something you'd light on an autumn evening. 2 logs. Not roaring. Not straining. Someone dropped to one knee without thinking and pressed a hand flat to the floor. It was warm. Not near the fire, everywhere. Warm like stone that had sat in the sun all day. Warm enough that you felt it through leather and wool. Warm enough to make your hands linger. "How?" someone whispered. The mountain man didn't answer immediately. He stepped aside, letting them crowd in, letting the numbers speak for themselves. The contrast was undeniable. Outside, death waited patiently. Inside, the cold had already lost. "I burned hot earlier," he said finally. "Then I let it go." They looked at the fire again, disbelieving. No one had ever survived a night like this by letting a fire die. But the fire wasn't what was keeping this cabin alive. The stone was. Under the floor. Around the hearth. Along the chimney's path. Thousands of pounds of it, holding heat quietly, steadily, long after flame had faded. A cabin that should have failed first had become the warmest place in the valley. And in that moment, standing in melting snow, surrounded by warmth that made no sense, the old rules of winter survival collapsed all at once. What they had mocked was working, and what they had trusted was not. Once the shock faded, understanding began to take its place. Men who had spent their lives building and surviving in cold country stopped looking at the cabin as shelter and started seeing it as a system. Nothing inside it was accidental. Every choice that had looked wrong on its own made sense once viewed together. The first truth was space. The cabin was small by design. Not cramped, but compact. Less air meant less heat required. In winter, air is an enemy. It warms quickly and escapes just as fast. Large rooms feel impressive, but they demand constant feeding. This cabin asked for less, and wasted almost nothing. The second truth was height. The low ceiling wasn't a flaw. It was control. Heat rises. Every extra foot above a man's head is another foot of warmth drifting where it does no good. By keeping the ceiling low, the cabin trapped heat where people lived, not where it vanished. Then came the stone. Thousands of pounds of dense rock formed the heart of the structure. Beneath the floor, around the firebox, along the chimney's interior path. Stone doesn't respond like air or wood. It warms slowly, but once heated, it refuses to give that warmth back quickly. The fire wasn't meant to run all night. It was meant to burn hard for a short time. During those hours, heat poured into the stone instead of racing up the chimney. The angled firebox spread radiant energy across surfaces instead of blasting it in one direction. The chimney, running through the living space before exiting, surrendered its heat to the room instead of gifting it to the sky. What remained after the flames died was something unfamiliar to most of them. Stored warmth. The floor itself became a heater. Not scorching. Not uneven. Just steady. Persistent warmth that rose slowly into the air above it. The cabin wasn't fighting the cold hour by hour. It was outlasting it. This wasn't magic. It was physics. Thermal mass. Reduced volume. Controlled airflow. Efficient transfer. Principles older than the mountains they stood in, but nearly forgotten here, where what had once been plentiful and space had seemed limitless. The mountain man hadn't built bigger. He'd built smarter. And for the first time, they understood that winter didn't reward effort. It rewarded understanding. No announcement was made. There was no meeting, no declaration that the old ways had failed. In the mountains, change rarely arrived with speeches. It arrived with observation and necessity. The next morning, men returned to their own cabins carrying more than warmth in their bones. They carried questions. Why did his fire burn less wood? Why did his floor stay warm? Why did the cold seem slower inside his walls? At first, the changes were small. A trapper shortened his ceiling when repairing storm damage. Another packed stone tighter beneath a drafty floor. Someone rerouted a chimney inward for a few feet before sending it outside, just enough to steal back some of the heat it once lost. No one called it copying. They called it learning. Families began to ask quiet questions. Not out of curiosity, but fear. How long could their wood last if this cold returned? What would happen if a child fell ill during a snap like this? Which cabins would hold, and which would fail? By midwinter, new structures began to rise. Not large ones. Not impressive ones. Compact cabins. Heavier than tradition allowed. Built lower to the ground. With stone where stone had once been avoided. Some men built sleeping benches over warm mass. Others extended stone inward beneath the floor, remembering how heat had crept up through their boots in that small cabin up the slope. The mountain man did not advertise his design. When asked, he answered simply. He pointed. He demonstrated. He let others touch the warm stone and feel the difference for themselves. He corrected no one harshly. He claimed no invention. It is not new, he said more than once. It is remembered. By the time the cold finally loosened its grip, the valley looked different. Not transformed, but altered. The changes were subtle, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. Smaller cabins, thicker walls, less smoke pouring into the sky. The idea had taken root. Not because it was clever, but because it worked. The lesson wasn't just about stone or fire. It never was. The Rockies had a way of stripping ideas down to their truth. Out here, comfort didn't come from abundance. It came from alignment between human choices and the realities of the land. Winter did not care how hard a man worked, how much timber he burned, or how confidently he believed in tradition. It cared only about results. For decades, settlers had built larger because they could. Timber was plentiful. Space felt endless. Firewood seemed replaceable. Bigger cabins felt like progress, proof that civilization had arrived. But winter had never agreed. That small cabin on the slope revealed something uncomfortable. Efficiency wasn't about doing more. It was about wasting less. Warmth wasn't created by flame alone, but by the discipline to keep heat from escaping once it was made. The mountain man hadn't fought the cold head-on. He'd stopped feeding it. By reducing space, lowering ceilings, and storing heat instead of chasing it, he built something that didn't struggle against winter. It simply endured it. The difference mattered. Struggle consumes resources. Endurance preserves them. Out here, preservation meant survival. There was a humility in that approach, a recognition that the land set the terms, that nature didn't need to be conquered, only understood. Those who learned this early lasted longer. Those who didn't often paid for it in silence. The mountains had seen countless versions of the same mistake. Build big. Burn harder. Hope it's enough. Sometimes it was. Often it wasn't. What spread through the valley, that winter wasn't just a new way to build. It was a quieter shift in thinking, a willingness to question whether tradition had become habit, and whether habit was still serving those who followed it. In the Rockies, wisdom wasn't loud. It was practical, and it arrived only after the cold made its point. The mountain man never became famous. There was no article written about him while he lived. No sketches sent east. No lecture halls where his ideas were debated. He didn't give the cabin a name, didn't mark it as a model, didn't claim ownership over what others began to build. That wasn't how knowledge moved in the frontier. It moved quietly, from one winter to the next, from one pair of hands to another. It passed through observation, imitation, and necessity, not through credit. When spring finally returned and the high snow began to rot in place, people took stock of what had survived the winter. Some cabins bore scars, split logs, warped floors, chimneys patched in desperation. Others stood intact, their interiors dry, their occupants stronger than expected. The difference wasn't luck. It was design. Those who had adopted even part of the mountain man's approach burned less wood. They slept longer. They worried less when night fell. They didn't boast about it. They simply lived better. The man himself returned to his routines. Trap lines. Repairs. Quiet days shaped by weather and light rather than conversation. If thanked, he nodded. If questioned, he answered. He never spoke as if he had taught anything. I only built what made sense, he said once. The cold teaches. I listened. That was the legacy. Not a blueprint carved into paper, but a pattern carved into memory. One that didn't depend on a single person to survive. One that could be picked up, adjusted, and passed on without ever needing to be named. Long after that winter faded into stories, the cabins remained. Smaller, heavier, warmer. Proof that the frontier didn't always advance by invention. Sometimes it advanced by remembering. And in places where winter still held power, that memory mattered more than any reputation ever could. Long after that winter loosened its grip on the Rockies, the cold remained part of the memory. Men would speak of it years later, not with excitement, but with respect. They remembered the sound of frozen snow underfoot, the way firewood vanished faster than planned, the quiet fear that came with each falling degree. And they remembered the winter when something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but permanently. The small, stone-heavy cabins didn't replace the old ways overnight. There were still large hearths and roaring fires. There always would be. But from that season on, fewer people believed that bigger automatically meant safer. Fewer trusted flame alone to carry them through the night. They had learned that warmth was not about fighting winter harder. It was about refusing to waste what you created. That lesson reaches far beyond one mountain valley. Even now, in a world of modern heating and endless fuel, at least for some, the same truth applies. Energy lost is energy paid for twice. Space unused is space still demanding warmth. And systems that ignore their environment always cost more in the end. The mountain man never set out to change how people built. He set out to survive. What followed was simply proof. Proof that old knowledge, shaped by centuries of cold, still worked when it was allowed to. Proof that intelligence didn't always look modern. And proof that sometimes the most advanced solution was the one that stopped chasing heat and started keeping it. So if there is something to carry forward from this story, it is this: when an idea looks small, heavy, and inefficient, ask whether it is protecting something you haven't considered. Because when winter returns, as it always does, comfort belongs not to the loudest fire, but to the structure that remembers warmth after the flames are gone. This is the spirit of the frontier. Not conquest, not excess, but understanding. And that understanding, quiet, practical, and hard-earned, is what truly endures.